Hello and welcome to this video all about the critical terms. It's all about the critical terms in assessment. Like so many industries, our vet industry, the vocational education and training industry, has a lot of jargon and a lot of specific language. If you study to be a doctor, if you study to be a nurse, if you study to be an electrician, it doesn't matter. There's a lot of language to learn, and there's a lot of language that's relevant to this specific assessment cluster. So what we're going to do is we're going to dive in and have a look at some of the language in the assessment cluster and reveal the meaning of some of these terms that might feel a little bit secretive if you're not familiar with them. And the first one is the term assessment to start with. So the term assessment is the big enchilada. It's the big term in this cluster. So what is assessment? Assessment isn't something that's thrown together. It isn't something ad hoc. It isn't something casual. It's something formal. So whenever we're thinking about the word assessment, I want you to think about the type of formal assessment. Don't think something ad hoc or something that some people have just thrown together. It's a serious undertaking. So breaking that down, what is assessment? Well, on the screen we can see it's the process. It's a process. It's not just a one-off thing. It's something that happens over time. And the process is about collecting evidence. It's about gathering evidence and putting it together to draw some conclusions. In fact, it's the process of collecting evidence and making judgments, making decisions on whether competency has been achieved. So it's all about two options: competent or not yet competent. Satisfactory, not yet satisfactory in the case of an individual decision. It's about making those choices. Let's recap. Assessment is the process of collecting evidence and making judgments on whether competency has been achieved to confirm that an individual can perform to the standard required in the workplace. So ultimately, it's about reaching a certain standard. And we have documentation, and we'll discuss that documentation during this assessment cluster. That documentation helps specify the standard, and it's about finding out if the candidate's performance is sufficient to meet that standard or exceed that standard. And if the candidate reaches that standard or exceeds that standard, we've got a winner. We've got good news for them. They're going to be deemed as satisfactory with that assessment or competent overall, as the case might be. So that's assessment in a nutshell what it's about. It's the number one key definition of relevance to us in the assessment cluster. Now, another definition that's very helpful is that of the assessment system. And the assessment system is basically bringing everything together and putting it together and having a structure. So as it says on the screen, an assessment system is a coordinated set of documented policies and procedures, including assessment materials and tools, that ensure assessments are consistent and are based on the principles of evidence and the rules of evidence. Now, this is a nice glowing definition. There's a lot there. The bit at the end about principles of assessment and rules of evidence, you'll be covering that later in this cluster. You'll be coming to it soon. So I won't address that right now. But that's basically, as it suggests, the principles and rules that guide effective assessment. We've got to respect those principles. We've got to respect those rules. We'll introduce you to those shortly. As we respect those principles and those rules, we're then able to put together an effective system of assessment. And that's what an assessment system is. It's documenting policies and procedures to develop an assessment system that's going to work in the situation that we're facing. All right. Let's move on to the next definition, which is something a little bit more tangible, and it's the start of the process, and that's the assessment plan. And as the name suggests, it's a plan for assessment. Nothing more complicated than that. As the definition says, an assessment plan is the overall planning document for the assessment process, which comprises a range of information to guide assessors. So before we start conducting assessments, before we start talking to our candidates about how they're going to assess or actually assessing them, we need to refer to the assessment plan. We need to document that plan and put it into action. And of course, the assessment plan is part of the assessment system, which helps us to deliver effective assessment. Now, just two more definitions that we want to cover here in the critical terms of assessment. I know there's a lot of language here. I hope this video is helping you to sort of just gel it within your mind and understand what these concepts are about generally. And I don't necessarily expect you to get a clear understanding of all these definitions from this one video. You might have to revisit this video a little bit later and have another look at it, and you may need to find that you look at the readings, and as you emphasize these terms and as you hear these terms over and over, they're going to start making a lot of sense to you. Here's another one: assessment instrument. Now, the assessment instrument is documentation. In fact, the assessment instrument is the part of assessment that we're all most familiar with, because we've all done tests. We've all been assessed in some capacity, even if it was back at school. And when we were assessed, there was a document, there was some paperwork involved. That paperwork is the assessment instrument. Sometimes the assessment instrument is completed by the candidate when they're doing a written test and you're writing your answers. Sometimes it might be filled out by the assessor themselves. For example, if it's an oral test, an oral interview, where the assessor is just asking the questions and the answers are being provided verbally by the candidate. The candidate isn't writing anything down, they're providing the answers verbally, but the assessor may be writing down their answers and writing down whether they're on track or not. Or it might be a checklist. It might not be questions at all. It might be a checklist where the assessor is watching the candidate do things and they're looking for them to do things in a certain sequence. As those steps are completed, the assessor checks it off on their list. That's their checklist. So the assessment instrument, as we see on the screen, is the documentation developed by an assessor to capture evidence or proof of competence. It's the record of what happened during the assessment event. Now, the assessment instrument is just one small piece of the assessment documentation that an assessor puts together. We talked about the plan earlier, and the plan will identify the assessment instruments. It will also identify more generally the assessment tool. And the assessment tool is the extra information that accompanies and that supports the assessment instrument. As we see on the screen, the assessment tool combines the assessment instrument with the instructions for the learners and the assessors. And in truth, it actually does a lot more than just combines the instrument and the instructions for learners and assessors. It might have detailed information about how it's to be marked and how it's to be assessed, how it's to be reviewed. It might have information in there about the validation processes to make sure that the assessment is being conducted out in a consistent way that works. So there's a heap of terms for you to consider. Assessment, assessment plan, assessment system, I should say, then assessment plan, assessment instrument, and assessment tools. Hope this video has helped you get an idea on what those terms mean. Good luck with your continuing studies.